ready to go to 500. I'm doing this to do the right thing for our country. We have been ripped off by China for a long time.
US President Donald Trump said he is ready to impose tariffs on $500 billion worth of Chinese goods to the US, almost the entire value of Chinese exports to the country. The US has already imposed tariffs on $34 billion worth of Chinese goods, with another $200 billion being looked at. China has retaliated with $34 billion worth of its own tariffs. How will this affect the US and Chinese economies? And how well prepared is China for a potential long-term trade war with the US?
Threats and intimidation on trade will not work on China. We have the confidence and capabilities to protect the interests of our people.
Meanwhile, as the Chinese yuan has been weakening against the dollar for some time, Trump has rebuked the Federal Reserve for raising interest rates, saying that both China and the EU are using currency policies to beat the US. Tensions are also continuing between the US and other trading partners such as Canada, Mexico and the European Union, fueling speculation that a global trade war could go on for a long period of time. Will that cause further consequences throughout the world? As producers of soybeans, corn, pork and more face steep taxes in China, Trump on Tuesday unveiled a plan to provide $12 billion to help US farmers caught in the crossfire of the trade war. But it turns out the proposal was not received well. The farmers want trade, not aid. So how effectively is Trump's rhetoric playing to his support within the country? And what's likely to happen in the US midterm elections later this year?
US President Donald Trump has indeed introduced the subsidies to buffer Chinese tariffs targeting US farmers while conceding to refrain from imposing tariffs on imported European cars after meeting European Commission President Jean-Claude Junker. So what's behind the concessions to the EU? Is Trump's buffering of his farmers an ominous sign for China? And what happens when China runs out of American imports to tariff? To discuss these issues and more, I'm happy to be joined in the studio by Mr. He Weiwen, a senior fellow at the Center for China and Globalization, Professor John Gong from the University of International Business and Economics, and Professor Jeffrey Towson from Peking University. We'll also be joined via satellite by Professor Steve Kin in Sydney, who's from the School of Social and Behavioral Sciences at Kingston University, London. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Pan Deng. Gentlemen, I'd like to start with a figure. U.S. trade deficit widened in June by 5.5%. What happened, Professor? Did Donald Trump's trade moves backfire?
Well, I think that, because of market expectation that this trade war is coming, so a lot of, exporting activities into the U.S. market has been accelerated in the preceding months. And also could be because of China. China's retaliatory tariffs on American exports to China. That probably also has an effect. So I think it's very clear that having these tariffs as a weapon is not going to do good for the trade, for the United States economy as well as for the world economy.
Well, will this negative momentum continue in the months to follow?
That we have to see. I think only 1 month of statistics is still too early to say there's a clear trend. But I think, but I'm not very optimistic about the future months ahead because the market is very nervous, and also I think there are some signs in China, for example, that the economy is slowing down. So that's a very concerning signal that I'm seeing.
And at the same time, at the WTO General Council meeting in Geneva, the United States is blaming China's economic model as the root cause of the current trade tensions between the two countries. How absurd is this, Mr.
Well, the United States always says that China's economic model is against the international rule of game because the government controls the economy and the government controls the market. Put the government ahead of the market. Actually, this is not the case because we do have individual issues, individual problems, but that's not the whole picture. In general, China's foreign trade follows the market because I think over 70% of China's exports were performed by private and joint ventures, and not private, not SOEs.
Talking about the role of the government, Donald Trump has just announced massive subsidies for American farmers on soybean. What do you make of his move like this?
I think this is a measure to quell a possible mutiny within the Republican Party. He's having a lot of pressure from the Republican senators and congressmen. The farmers in the Midwest are really hurting. I mean, look at the soybean price. It's dropped way below $10 per bushel, and about like an 18% drop already. So the farmers are getting a very strong hit. So he has to do something about it. So that's why he's introducing this $12 billion program for the farmers. On the other hand, I think it also sort of indicates that he is ready to hang on there for some time. These tariff measures going to be there for some time. We are, still very far away from seeing the light at the end of the tunnel. This is a strong signal that he's going to stick there and continue to use the tariff as a weapon. So I think that doesn't bode well for this negotiation between U.S. and China, if it's ever taking place right now. And
I think soybean is just one example of how damaging unilateralism can be in a multilateral trading system. How damaging is such unilateral trade moves against the global production and value chain, Professor Towson?
I think what we're discovering, and some people knew this already, some are discovering it, is when you do a move like this, you look at the first result. What's the first result? And maybe we can predict that. But it's the second, third, and fourth that seem to be surprise after surprise after surprise. Brazilian farmers, I was in Brazil when the aluminum, the aluminum and steel tariffs first started. It hit them quicker than anybody. And they kind of said, what does this have to do with us? So you're going to see this ripple in lots of ways, and I think a lot of it's unpredictable. And then, that first result may not be the only thing you're going to get.
What about in the corporate world? For example, this Qualcomm merger case with NXP, it failed, right?
Right. I mean, the trade has interesting effects, but there's also a wider effect on the business community. I'm a business person. This is what I understand. We don't call it the trade war. We call it the big pause. We don't know what we can do. Can we build the factory? I don't know. Qualcomm and NXP, this deal had been going on for a couple of years. As of a month ago, it needed the Chinese regulatory approval. It had all the others. As of a month ago, the indication from the reports of the press was the Chinese government was going to approve this. It was fine. They ended up not approving it, but I don't think they disapproved it. Just the clock ran out on the deal because everyone was waiting. It was the pause. And unfortunately, there was a hard end on this deal. If it didn't happen by now, that was it, according to the terms. So the Qualcomm walked away. But it's because we were all waiting. How many business people are just kind of waiting around right now, waiting?
You're right. Yes.
I think that's just a sort of separate issue. It doesn't have anything to do with the trade war. This is an antitrust issue here. Qualcomm's acquisition of NXP needs a merger review process from the Ministry of used to be Ministry of Commerce Antitrust Bureau. And in my understanding of this proposed merger, the concern for this merger is because that Qualcomm has a dominant position in the handset chip space, and NXP acquired a Motorola's Freescale division, which is dominant in the chip space for automobiles. So now you have a combination of those two, and combining handsets and mobile automobile cars represents the future, right? So you have a company combining these strengths in both industries and having a dominant position in both really poses a concern for market dominance. So I'm an antitrust economist, and just from my own perspective, I would say that there is a concern here, but I haven't really looked into the details and information yet, so I'm not in a position to comment on this case in a very detailed way. But at least I think we should wait until the Ministry of Commerce Antitrust Bureau to come out with kind of a statement or report saying why they've been holding on to this decision for so long and what are the rationale behind this. But I think there's a statement from the Ministry of Commerce already saying that if it's the Ministry of Commerce or somebody else, I'm not sure, I can't remember correctly. But I think the statement is very clear. This has nothing to do with the Sino-US trade war. It's a separate decision. It's a competition policy issue. So I think we shouldn't make too much of this merger request. And you know, in China there are 400 filings every year. Mergers and acquisition requests that needs to go through Ministry of Commerce and Antitrust Bureau's approval process. And most of these mergers went through. A few of them got blocked. I was involved in a few cases.
Right, whatever it is, it's a big pause for business. But Professor Towson, could the trade tensions turn into a big blow to investment confidence?
If not confidence, then uncertainty. That's the word. It's uncertain. We don't quite know. Should we put forward a new merger going through regulatory approval given the certain situation? How will that play out in Europe? How will that play out in Canada, US, Mexico, China? All these countries are involved in various disputes, negotiations at this point. Build the big factory, the new auto plant. Harley-Davidson is getting caught in the middle of this, which ironically is sort of a flagship, historic American brand, and they're not quite sure where to build their manufacturing plant. It turns out it's getting harder to get steel and things and get it into Europe, and you know they're in the middle of this, and I don't think they know what to do.
Right, talking about uncertainty, Mr. He, let's talk about this EU-US, I would say consensus on trade tensions, because let's not get carried away by the Trump rhetoric. It's not a deal. It's a deal about future talks to reach a deal, right? So should we worry about this?
I don't think this is something very serious we have to worry about right now at this point, because this is only a gesture showing their intention to do next. If they really go into the trade deal that will last for years, for 3 zeros and many others. And the United States and EU started TTIP negotiation at the start of 2014, which was expected at that time to finish in 2 years, but it failed halfway. And that was quite similar with 3 zeros and something else. So we have to wait and see. I think at least the United States and the European Union at this point came to a consensus. They wanted to avoid trade war. They wanted to build a large trade market. That was something hitting. Of course, the French President Macron also said he was against. He said, first of all, the United States has to scrap up the steel and armament tax, tariffs. I think maybe this is a bargain by the French President to get something more before doing seriously forward.
Right. For more on this, let's talk to Professor Steve Keen in Sydney. He's from Kingston University in London. Hello, Professor. Let's talk about this EU-US latest meeting in Washington, D.C. Do you think the two sides will actually start real negotiations on a zero tariff deal between across the Atlantic?
No, I don't think it will happen, and I think this is a typical thing coming out of Trump's personality problems more than any serious attempt at negotiation. I think Junker managed to sweet-talk him as he needs to be sweet-talked with his ego problem, and he comes out saying something which is quite extreme. I don't think it will be followed through on. There may be some tariff reductions, perhaps. He may not put up the tariff barriers he was talking about doing to the European Union. But so long as there's a trade surplus in Europe's favour with America, which is not going to change, particularly with Germany's favour, I think he'll go back to his previous position after some more theatricals.
We know that China and Australia negotiated for 9 years for a free trade agreement, and also European Union and Japan negotiated for at least 4 years to reach the latest deal. Give us an idea how difficult these talks could be.
Well, always extremely difficult, because for a start, free trade deals are not free trade deals. They're very detailed statements of the arrangements which will apply, for example, whose copyright laws are going to apply, how long copyright might apply for, whether the trade deal applies to services, tariff rates, whether there's any offsets for value-added tax, which of course America doesn't have at the national level, versus value-added taxes elsewhere, and special favours where particular industries will negotiate for deals that are different for them for other industries. So they're calling them free trade, I think, is quite a misnomer. And it applies, it can happen very rapidly. Again, these things do take, as you say, up to a decade to negotiate. And they are not necessarily, they're not panaceas. They're treated as panaceas by economists because their textbook models say that free trade makes things better. That's not true empirically, and there will always be battles against them, in any case, by various industry sectors that don't want to be exposed to competition.
Having said that, let's talk about another big and uncertain factor in this. That is Trump's tactics. He changes so fast that no one can predict. Do you think the European side will worry about this in the future?
I'm not sure. I mean, Trump's political appeal really came out of reaching out to people in the Midwest of America who'd seen their factories decay courtesy of Chinese corporations and Chinese government quite sensibly exploiting a loophole in the tariff laws of America that enabled them to re-export to America without paying any extra tariff on the value added by the Chinese manufacturing sector. And China's been quite successful at building a very strong industrial nation with the interest of its people at heart, whereas American corporations have really denigrated their own workers in the whole process. And that political angst is what Trump is exploiting. There's no real possibility of him moving away to free trade deals and alienating that base. I think he'll always return back to the base. But I'll see it as a very cynical exercise rather than the more genuine one that China executed in favour of its people ever since Deng Xiaoping.
So what about EU's internal differences? For example, as we just briefly mentioned, French President Emmanuel Macron has said that he's not in favor of a brand new trade deal with the United States. And also, what about Germany?
Yeah, well, Germany has obviously been the major beneficiary of the Eurozone, and it's imposed its own rules on the rest of the continent to the cost of those southern countries which can't devalue against Germany, where Germany always tries to maintain a lower rate of inflation. So the internal conflicts, I think, of the European zone, frankly, in my opinion, should lead to the breakup of the euro. Whether they will or not is a question of political tolerance. But there was never any sense in a country like Germany, which tries to achieve an inflation rate of about 1%, tying itself to countries like Italy, which normally has a much higher rate of inflation and therefore can't devalue against the Germans and necessarily loses out of internal trade. So the European Union is not going to be an easy beast to negotiate with, because at one extreme Germany will want to have dropping of tariffs and so on. At the other extreme, as even Macron is now showing, those countries don't want to be forced to compete even with other countries as much as they're forced into a losing competition with Germany.
Thank you very much, Professor Steve Keen in Sydney. You're watching Dialogue on CGTN. Stay with us. Gentlemen, let's continue our discussion on global trade uncertainties. Earlier we were talking about EU-US trade tensions and possible efforts to ease the tension. And now, in this statement after President Donald Trump's meeting with Jean-Claude Juncker, the two sides have mentioned possibility of EU importing LNG from liquefied natural gas from the United States. Is that realistic? Because EU can get it from Russia with a better price.
Well, I don't know if you watched that. You know, Donald Trump was admonishing the European Union delegation in front of all cameras for like 3 or 4 or 5 minutes, talking about this, saying that Germany is being a captive of Russia, and he said that he's pro-trade, but energy is an entirely different story. Okay, so this is the background. I think Donald Trump is trying to sell LNG, American energy products to the European market, which actually I think it's okay. But the issue is that LNG trade needs facilities. European is in the process of constructing these LNG storages and other processing facilities in coastal area cities. And that takes a lot of investment. And once you do that, you're pretty much being, instead of being captive of Russia, you're captive of Americans. So that is why there's a very interesting and important statement in Juncker's press release, saying that provided that the pricing is right and pricing is competitive. So I think that's a very clear signal that the Europeans are indeed concerned that if we buy gasoline from the Americans, that has to be competitive. Overall, the price from the gasoline from Russia is definitely cheaper. The LNG from Russia is definitely cheaper than shipping things across the Atlantic and into Europe. So I think that's the background. But gasoline energy is always different. There's always this political, geopolitical angle behind this. So I think that's what Donald Trump is coming from.
And talking about this US-EU latest meeting, they mentioned the possibility of negotiations on a new arrangement in free trade, for example, zero tariffs. So what's the implication here to the WTO mechanism? Are they trying to bypass the WTO mechanism?
No. That's, even if such a huge free trade arrangement is reached, this is still regional or cross-regional. It's not a multilateral. And in the world, there are over 400 such like RTAs, FTAs, that's supplementary to WTO. The WTO covers the whole world. However, what they are targeting is not only the European and the Union and the United States, and not only the free trade zone among themselves, but also to change WTO rules on the basis of their new rules they think the most update. So that would be the main challenge to WTO.
We know that earlier EU and Japan reached a new free trade agreement with higher political trust documents signed.
Yes.
So should China be worried about this?
We have to pay attention to that. But it's unlike some people may explain that Japan, European Union, and United States are linked together by zero tariffs. A huge free trade market that will be challenged to China. But if we look at more facts, European Union has had free trade agreements with a number of countries already, and Japan has dozens of countries of free trade agreements. So that's normal. And China also is negotiating Japan, Korea, China free trade agreement. And China and the European Union just agreed to prepare FTA negotiations. And with the United States, we had the FTA agreement, no, not the FTA, the BIG negotiation, but later you lost. But we prepared ultimately to have FTA negotiation with the United States. So that's the free trade market in the world of China would be part of it.
And at the same time, China's determination to further opening up its market to the world is consistent. For example, in this November, a major expo, China International Import Expo, will be held in Shanghai. What opportunities will this bring to global businesses, Professor Towson?
Yeah. Underneath all the trade and the policy, it comes down to businesses and people and who's good and who builds competitive products and things like that. And China is fantastic. The market is fantastic. The companies are fantastic. I would say the same thing about the United States, because I'm familiar with those two. Not to slight the EU, I just don't work there. Yesterday, I took about 35 students from Italy who came in from Torino to learn. They know a lot about China. They're the China experts. And I took them to Jingdong campus and walked, and they were stunned. They were stunned at the scale and the speed and the people. So, yeah, underneath all the trade in this talks, import-export is going to be fantastic. The goods are going to get created. The market's going to do well. So I'm very optimistic, but then I don't work in policy and trade.
What about currency, Professor Junker? We know that US President Donald Trump has described China as a currency manipulator recently. Do you think that's the truth?
Well, I mean, he never calls China currency manipulator when
right.
when RMB.
By the way, EU is facing the same accusation earlier from Donald Trump.
Right. Yeah. So every time other currencies depreciates, he thinks everybody else is manipulating his currency. That it shouldn't be taken seriously. I mean, the U.S. government has, I think, the Treasury Department usually has a evaluation of China's currency every year or every 3 years, I think, right? And none of the reports from the Treasury Department so far has indicated that China is a currency manipulator. That is from his own government. So I think that's an overkill, and it's just something that doesn't make sense to me. But I think the fundamental reason behind this is that the market realizes that the current account in the next few months will not be as good as in the previous months. We are having a trade war right now. China's exports to the United States is going to be hampered, and the foreign exchange reserve balance in the U.S. is going to drop. So I think that's just a market reaction. And in hindsight, I think the drop is actually not that big. I mean, it depreciates from 6.2, 6.3 to right now 6.8. It's still very much within a range of normal market fluctuation. A little bit more, maybe a little bit more than that. But overall, it's not that a long-term trend, in my opinion. I think the RMB is still going to maintain a ratio somewhere below 7, maybe around a 7, but not going to be depreciating too much. So the accusation that it's a currency manipulator, it doesn't make sense to me.
So just a curious question and provide some background knowledge to our viewers. Why Trump pays so much attention to China's foreign exchange rate? How does that relate to a trade war?
Well, typically a country's currency's depreciation helps with its exports. In other words, makes Chinese exports in the U.S. A lot more competitive, less costly. So it helps with exports basically. Another thing that driving currency depreciation of renminbi is the issue of dollar. Dollar is getting stronger. Dollar is getting stronger for several reasons. First of all, the interest rate in the United States is going up. So the interest rate parity between China and the U.S. is actually widened. So that means that the U.S. currency, the dollar, is getting stronger. And so, accordingly, our currency is getting a bit weaker. And that makes our exports more competitive in the United States. And this is something he's very concerned about. He views trade deficit as a loss. So that's a loss to him. He's not happy with the loss.
Thank you very much, gentlemen, for your input. And that's it for this edition of Dialogue on CGTN. I'm Pan Dong in Beijing. Bye-bye.